Good morning. I'm a lady with a lot of stuff. I'm just kind of getting organized. So, as billed, the topic that I'm going to explore with you all today has to do with feelings of connection and really to focus on our collective unmet needs that relate to connection between people. So, as I start this morning, I'm going to share with you an excerpt from Sherwood Anderson's 1918 novel, Winesburg, Ohio. It's one of my favorites. If it's not one of yours, give it a go. In this section from Hands, which is right in the beginning, right after the prologue, the Book of the Grotesque, we meet two important characters right as this novel kicks off. We meet George Willard, who is the novel's protagonist, and he is a young man working as a reporter in the small town of Winesburg, Ohio. We also meet a featured character, Wing Biddlebaum. And Wing Biddlebaum is a 20-year resident of Winesburg, and he now lives in isolation on the outskirts of this small town. And so as I read, I always like to challenge my own students to listen for something that we're going to talk about later. So listen for, and then we're going to talk about together. We're going to talk about this theme of connectedness between people and our strong hesitations and reservations and our internal dialogue that prevents us from having those kinds of connections. So listen for that as I read from Hands by Sherwood Anderson's Winesburg, Ohio. Upon the half-decayed veranda of a small frame house that stood near the edge of a ravine near the town of Winesburg, Ohio, a fat little old man walked nervously up and down across a long field that had been seeded for clover, but that had produced only a dense crop of yellow mustard weeds. He could see the public highway along which went a wagon filled with berry pickers returning from the fields. Wing Biddlebaum, forever frightened and beset by a ghostly band of doubts, did not think of himself as in any way a part of the life of the town where he had lived for 20 years. Among all the people of Winesburg, but one had come close to him. With George Willard, son of Tom Willard, the proprietor of the new Willard house, he had formed something like a friendship. George Willard was the reporter on the Winesburg Eagle, and sometimes in the evenings he walked out along the highway to Wing Biddlebaum's house. Now, as the old man walked up and down the veranda, his hands moving nervously about, he was hoping that George Willard would come and spend the evening with him. After the wagon containing the berry pickers had passed, Wing Biddlebaum went across the field through the tall mustard weeds and, climbing a rail fence, peered anxiously along the road to the town. For a moment he stood thus, rubbing his hands together and looking up and down the road, and then, fear overcoming him, ran back to the walk again upon the front porch of his own house. In the presence of George Willard, Wing Biddlebaum, who for 20 years had been the town mystery, lost something of his timidity, and his shadowy personality, submerged in a sea of doubts, came forth to look at the world. With the young reporter at his side, he ventured into the light of day, into Main Street, or strode up and down on the rickety front porch of his own house, talking excitedly. The voice that had been low and trembling became shrill and loud. The bent figure straightened. With a kind of wriggle, like a fish returned to the brook by their fishermen, Biddlebaum, the silent, began to talk, striving to put into words the ideas that had been accumulated by his mind during the long years of silence. So as Iris mentioned when she introduced me, I teach English and communication classes, and when she invited me to share some thoughts with you this morning, my mind connected to something that I often observe in public speaking classes that I actually think is much more universal than just my own limited observations. And it's worth noting that since 2017, I've taught more than 1,000 local college students in introductory to public speaking classes. And one of them is in this very room among you. As you might imagine, the first day of class is typically filled with a host of visibly apprehensive students. Most would not choose that course as part of their schedule if it were not a requirement. And some students, as you might imagine, have strong, underlined, strong hesitations to overcome in order to become effective public speakers. So I wish that today's message could be about sharing the secret sauce that helps all people to overcome without any further impediment, their own fear of public speaking. And I'm working on mine, you are likely working on yours. We all, in our collective human experience, find public speaking highly unnatural. And why? Because public speaking is highly unnatural. It is a threat to our feelings of safety, belonging, need, security, all of these things. It sets off all of these alarm bells in our own systems. It's impossible to override. And so students, while I hope strangely comforted on day one, also get the wisdom that you got to find a way to live with this, because there's no way to eliminate it. A hesitation for public speaking is part of the human experience. And we're going to get better at it over the next 16 weeks, is usually what I say. But there is no secret sauce. I wish that I could say that there is. Something that would help students to exchange their lack of confidence with whatever it is that makes the content creators they follow online so engaging. I wish that we could swap those things out. At the same time, though there are challenges to get students to achieve proficiency in public speaking, I'm happy to report to you all that most of the students whose names appear on my course rosters at the beginning of each term are objectively pretty clever conversationalists. You just have to catch them in the right number, in the right moment, in the right mood. But when we enter into conversation with students, they do great. So, for me then, the challenge rests in helping students find confidence in their everyday conversation skills and then to help extend that level of newfound comfort to more formalized messages that they would give. But a bigger truth of this is that I spend a lot of time thinking about what makes talking to or in front of people we don't know the significant challenge we know it to be. In the wake of the pandemic, the rapid evolution of internet technologies and medias, the demeanor of students now, as compared with 5 years ago, is visibly different. And I'm sad to report that to you. But my experience tells me that what's changing in my students has less to do with communication skills or social skills than instead the effects of isolation and loneliness. And that's an impact that I think is much more broadly felt. And something that I think that even if you aren't a freshman in a public speaking class during the fall or spring term, I think it's pretty relatable, these concepts of extended isolation and a deep feeling of loneliness. And I've come to think and become kind of fixated on this as an issue. And we have, unfortunately, more data now than ever to alert us to the long-term effects of what it means to live as a chronically lonely person. So let's look at that data. A large-scale research review from 2010, a number of years before the pandemic, examined studies investigating social relationships and mortality risk. And the review concluded that low social connection has as much an impact on our mortality rate as not exercising. It's twice as harmful as being overweight. The review also indicated loneliness affects morbidity just as much as a smoking or even an alcohol problem. But wait, there's more data. In 2021, psychologists at Harvard conducted a study that investigated loneliness across nearly 1,000 American subjects. Across these American participants, 36% reported feeling lonely either frequently or almost all of the time. That's more than 1 in 3. And if you look at the two neighbors, the one to your left and the one to your right, and then you factor yourself in, chances are, statistically, one of the 3 of you feels, worth repeating, feeling lonely frequently or almost all the time. The study also examined the frequency of loneliness across age groups. And here's where I really paid close attention to the results of this study. When they striated the data and looked at adults aged 18 to 25, and that's the vast majority of the students that I encounter in my own classes, 61% of respondents in that age category report feeling lonely frequently or almost all the time. That's nearly 2/3 of adults aged 18 to 25. And again, that's current data from 2021. Thank you, Harvard. So, where do Wing Biddlebaum and George Willard factor into the discussion of our current dilemma of loneliness? The central idea I'm circling here is the problem that people are desperate for connection with one another. It's part of our ingrained human need. And at the same time, people feel profound shame for having these social needs that go unmet. If you're familiar with Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy of needs, now is a good time to recall that among all of our human needs, structured into a pyramid form, if you can see the Maslow graphic in your mind's eye, Maslow characterizes our need to belong as second only to our basic survival needs. So they rank high. Wing Biddlebaum traverses a field of yellow mustard greens in the hope of just spotting George Willard headed down the laneway in the same way that we hope that someone will notice when we have a new pair of shoes or a fresh haircut or to congratulate us on an accomplishment at work. But I would ask you, despite dismal data, try not to be too bummed out because Doctors John and Julie Gottman, who founded together the Gottman Institute, these are relationship psychologists, they coined the phrase bids for connection. And I really find this an interesting and very simple way of looking at human communication. And it helps us take a closer look at the way we express our need to connect with other people. So by definition, a bid for connection is a communication attempt for attention, for affirmation, or for affection. And we exchange these all the time in ways that are subtle, in ways that are understood, in ways that are heard or dismissed or rejected or totally unseen. In Anderson's hands, it's not only Biddlebaum's frenetic pacing along the veranda of his home, hoping that George Willard will just happen by and allow him to enter into the only conversational space where he could feel some level of comfort. But also, there's a bid for connection on Willard's part, a much easier one to overlook. But his own frequent constitutionals along the outskirts of town also function as bids for connection. So the good news here is that bids for connection can be adjusted to account for a person's lack of social bravery. So I think one of the important takeaways when we think about this concept of bids for connection is that they absolutely could be as complicated as a beautifully phrased marriage proposal. What a bid for connection, right, Scott Giltner? But it also could be a wink between colleagues in a meeting that could have been an email. These are both bids for connection, and both the simple and the complex and everything in between. These bids for connection, I think if we give them a greater consideration, it's easy for us to look at communication in a much simpler way. The wink that could have been an email could be a very effective bid for connection, and a very overt attempt to bond with someone could also go ignored or could backfire or could be shut down. And so I think that dialing down the level of simplicity, which is really more advice for myself, myself having invented the game of making things harder than they have to be, more complicated than they have to be. I'm so good at that. In fact, I have a little quip that I want to share with you. I grew up in a neighborhood that I still live in, and I can remember knowing all of my neighbors when I was a kid growing up, and there were very, very few other kids in our neighborhood. So my sister Sarah and I played with our Easy Bake Oven, and on rainy days would make like the world's tiniest little cakes, which now today are probably like boutique, like $14 cupcakes, but at the time they were just Easy Bake Oven cakes of the 80s. And we would take them to elderly neighbors on rainy days, and that was just good, wholesome childhood fun. I know, don't think too much of me though, Lisa, because I live in the same neighborhood, and those neighbors have passed or have moved, and I don't know my neighbors. I know very few of my neighbors. And so when I look to make a new habit, I tend to visualize an extreme version of implementing that change. So here's the neighbor dilemma. We get a new neighbor on Harrison Street in Quincy. And I take note of this because I'm the Gladys Kravitz of Harrison Street. And so a new neighbor moves in, and I think to myself, how nice it would be if I made a banana bread and I walked it over and I introduced myself and I learned their names and I got to pet their dog and all that fun stuff. But then in my mind, I level that up. Now I'm going to take them a two-tiered cake, and now I'm going to decorate it, and now I'm going to just be like that neighbor, the most neighbor. But then I freak myself out with this promise to myself to be that neighbor. I can't be that neighbor. And so I procrastinate for a week, or 2 or 3, and they've fully moved in. Like the U-Haul's been returned to the place where it was rented from. They're moved in. They're hanging stuff on the walls, which is something that we are still working on 10 years after moving into our house. And then I end up not meeting the neighbor at all because I made this ambitious plan of I want to impress them. I want to include them. And I just made it so extra. I made it so complex that I actually intimidated myself out of doing it. So what I end up doing is just giving up on the whole task. And I never managed to get much further than just waving when we see one another pulling in and out of our driveways or taking the former act of taking recycling out to the curb. Did you catch the shade there? Thanks, Stephen. Love the planet, everybody. We've got to keep loving the planet. All right. But that's my story about neighbors. The kernel of wisdom within that revealing of myself is that I think a big part of these bids for connection is that we overthink them. We make them too complicated. We wait too long. We hesitate. We second guess ourselves. There's a real simplicity in bids for connection that reduces that misfire rate. And that makes it not such a big deal when you extend a bid for connection that just goes over somebody's head, or it's just not the right place, not the right time, not the right person. But the important kernel here is that those bids for connection are incredibly necessary in our post-pandemic life. And that the people that we share this human existence with need that communication and deserve that communication, and so do you. And so the time for me to stop overthinking not knowing my neighbors and not being their most favorite neighbor, I just need to be a good neighbor. I just need to say hello. I just need to know their names. I would love to pet their dogs too, but I really just need to know who they are, and I need them to know who I am. And we can build from there. It doesn't have to start at this 10 out of 10 interaction. It doesn't have to be super powerful. It doesn't have to be super palpable. But the fact that it happened, I want you to do something and visualize something. And you can close your eyes if it gives you the full effect. But I want you to think about the last compliment that you were offered by a stranger. Try and remember, okay? Once you have that in your mind's eye, can you remember what they looked like? In my mind's eye, they're a little fuzzy. And can you remember what they said to you? I can't remember exactly how they phrased it, but I can remember the meaning of their message. What I bet you will remember really, really clearly is how that interaction, how that compliment, how did it make you feel? You remember that pretty clearly, yeah? I think that those remembrances, when we look at this big idea of bids for connection, simple compliments can change your day. Simple kindnesses can stick with you. Common courtesies can take a really awful day and help to reframe it. So, I have some advice in pulling away from this idea of connection and that we need it. The data tells us that there is an extreme level of need. And we can identify this particular populations that are particularly in need of a reprieve from their loneliness. But I think the big universal truth is that we're kind of all there. We're kind of all there right now. We're kind of all needing bids for connection, to extend them more, to receive them more, and to allow that idea of bids for connection to plug into our practice of gratitude. I think that's also an important way that we can move forward. So here are some pieces of advice that I want to share about maximizing these bids for connection. I want you to first assume that the simplicity of the exchange has no bearing on the value of the interaction. It does not have to be a two-tiered cake perfectly decorated for your new neighbor. You just need to know their name, and they just need to hear that you're glad that they're in your neighborhood. A cake wouldn't hurt. I'm not saying that a cake wouldn't hurt. I also would advise you not to resist the itch. And if you have an active inner dialogue like I do, you probably talk yourself out of extending lots of bids for connection. I trash a lot of mine. Heather, that's weird. Heather, don't go up to somebody and tell them, stop, don't say that. That is weird. If a stranger came up to you, if a stranger came up to me, I'd fully be into it. I'd really like that. I really would. And sometimes that's the thing that I'm like, no, I don't think it wouldn't feel weird to me. I want to know that dog's name. I want to know, like, do you really like driving that 7-passenger Subaru? I want to know. Don't resist that itch. When you feel a temptation to start a conversation, even if it's with someone that you don't recognize, don't know, haven't seen, as long as you're not getting that stranger danger vibe, green, light it, go with it. Follow that intuition. And I think that's a part of how Spirit can work with us, that maybe we do have more of an intuition than we give ourselves credit for being intuitive about the chronically lonely in our life. And when there's something that just appears in the front of your brain, I should tell them that I really like their cologne. I should ask them where they got those shoes. We should follow through on these things because they do have meaning. A lot of simple communication is exactly where we plant beautiful relationships. They do begin as two people who are strangers, who later find out that they have a common interest or that they have a shared value in common. But sometimes we have to learn a dog's name and eat a piece of cake and shake a hand and introduce ourselves. It does need to start there. And it's an easy, accessible place for us to start. I would also remind you that we can rewire our expectation of the negative. And I think that post-pandemic life is an excellent time and place for us to rewire the way our brain expects our human interactions to be unpleasant, to be rude, to be negative. I think the greater the level of openness that we can present to our human public, I think the more opportunity we will create to be surprised at the quality and the depth of those interactions. I also think that the benefits of conversation serve both parties. Paying a compliment scientifically has very similar impacts on the brain as receiving them. It feels good to talk to new people. It feels good to discover a point of connection that you share with someone. And it's not all that significant that you may not see that person ever again because they were just standing behind you in the line for the pharmacy at Walgreens. It may not have to be that much, that big, that significant, but for that moment, it was an important point of connection. Someone, because you were there and because you said something, because you gestured something, because you signaled something to them, they felt seen. They felt like they were good. They felt like they mattered. And I think these are very basic points that are pretty easy for us to remind one another of, even the people that we don't know. And I think that one thing that qualifies bids of connection, who are our friends again? Doctors John and Julie Gottman. When they coined this phrase, bids for connection. They did this as relational psychologists. Their work focuses mostly on interactions between couples. But we see that bids for connection has been extended to all kinds of relationships, romantic relationships, but relationships within family systems, relationships between colleagues, friends, even strangers. And one of the most important things that I took away with the concept of bids for connection is that moments of significant connection can and do happen between strangers. You may have colleagues that you see all the time at work, and you know their name, and you know where their office is, and you wave to them, but you may not have ever really extended a true bid for connection or seen one coming from them to you. Conversely, you may be standing in a very long line at the pharmacy at Walgreens and hear a lot and connect a lot with someone that you didn't know. And I think that's kind of a magic in human communication, is that sometimes we don't get to pick when and how those communications click or don't click. Sometimes there is just a magic alchemy in talking to someone that you don't know. And I think that's something that would be good for us to kind of move outside of our comfort zone and see how far we might take that. See what the impact of simple, common courtesies and compliments and holding doors open or letting the guy with 2 bananas and a container of cottage cheese go in front of you at Aldi. If you ever want to reconnect to your beliefs about humanity, please just go to Aldi and stand in the parking lot without a quarter. Do it. Do it. And tell me if you stand out there for more than 3 minutes, because that's a real slice of humanity is the Aldi experience. It's like a courtesy off, like who can, pass it on to the next person. You will hear that on like the bingo board for shopping at Aldi. That's absolutely what you're going to hear. There are places for this to happen. There are places for you to test out the skill, to reconnect yourself with this muscle memory of talking to people all the time, which I'm out of practice, and maybe you are too. But in closing, I want you to think about the lonely people that you know in your life. And I want you to extend low-level bids for connection. It does not have to be the 2-tier cake. And I want you to watch for bids for connection, because the loneliest among us send out just as many bids for connection, but they are a little bit different. They risk rejection, and that's one of the big things that keeps people from communicating their needs. But just because that bid for connection is subtle doesn't mean that the need for that connection is not deeply felt. So be simple, be yourself, and the most important reminders we can offer each other are very simple things. You are seen, you are good, and you matter. Thanks for listening to my thoughts this morning.